Andrew and Tracy asked me to talk about character development, and I'm certainly going to talk about that, but my focus is going to be on character virtues, character strengths, and 4 foundations for the study of that, both theoretical and methodological. So why focus and why emphasize character virtues? Well, I think the best way to rationalize that is to start with a very famous quote from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King from his I Have a Dream speech. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. What Dr. King is referring to is that the content of a person's character can be good or bad. And it's clear that parents, teachers, practitioners, policymakers want that content to be marked by virtues, by things that we want to see promoted in people. Why? Character virtues are fundamental strengths of individuals. They're equivalent to the strengths that we've devoted much more attention to in developmental science, things like physical health, academic and social competence. But character virtues are significant strengths, not only because of what they do for the young person, but they have a very special secondary role or second role. I wouldn't call it secondary, second role. And that is they serve society as well. They help the social world to thrive. There's a synergistic connection between a person who has character strengths, character virtues, and the contributions he or she makes to the institutions of civil society and social justice. And a nation marked by leadership from those people is a nation that is emblematically one that supports social justice, that decreases disparities. The absence of a nation led by people of character virtues may create a nation marked by oppression, discrimination, injustice, and even fascism. Leading theorists in the field of character virtue development, people like Larry Nucci and Marvin Berkowitz, have underscored this intimate connection between individual thriving through the possession of character virtues and social justice and civil society. Larry Nucci says 10 years ago, a fundamental feature of character virtue development involves interpersonal relations, the sort of relations that Andrew referred to in his opening remarks, marked by a concern with human welfare, justice, and rights. And Marvin Berkowitz, who in my view is the leading person, certainly in the US, but perhaps the world in character education, has said character virtue development involves a public system of universal concerns about human welfare, justice and rights that all rational people would want to adhere to. We're talking about a specific content of character. What Dr. King referred to is not the enumeration of specific actions that we may evaluate for their presence or absence, because any specific action may be useful or not, depending on the time or place, the society and culture, the historical moment in which it's enacted. Nevertheless, despite that relational dependence between a character virtue and contributions to self and society, people have not held back in giving long lists of what they believe are the, capital T-H-E, correct or fundamental character strengths. My colleague Bob McGrath came up with this list. I want to emphasize this is not my list, and it is very Western-centric, as you can see. But it shows the different attributes that people have listed from Aristotle on, Plato, Aristotle, and on, that people believe were the key characteristics, the key content of good character, of a person with character strengths or character virtues. I'll come back to this list because it's woefully inadequate if we are going to have a global perspective about character development. Larry Nucci, who is one of the leading theorists in both character development and character education, made a keynote address at the US's National Academy of Sciences in 2016 at the first ever National Academy of Sciences forum on character development. And then in Marvin's journal, Journal of Character Education, he published the text of his talk. So Larry emphasizes that that character is not a collection of virtues or personality traits. I'll come back to that several times. Character is a system of person and context relations that enables the person to engage as a moral agent in his or her world. It therefore functions synergistically, coactively, bidirectionally with the social context. And character, because social context changes across time and place, character provides coherence, not consistency. If you do the same thing across time and place, that's not a mark of good character. And it's in fact not many people said, oh, if you change what you do across time and place, that shows that you have a moral failing. To the contrary, I'm going to argue that it's consistency that's important. I'm sorry, coherence that's important, not consistency. And I'm going to use Aristotle as one basis of that. So what Nucci argues is attempts to impose an impossible level of consistency through constructs such as trait. One of my key takeaways is do not use the term character traits any longer in your vocabulary. Relates to a person that doesn't exist, that exists free of context. It's the context-person relation that's important. What Larry says actually points to what I see as the four foundational bases for the study of character virtue development. And these ideas are not only important for academics, but they have important implications for program evaluation, but also for civil society and for social justice. And I'll come back to that as well at the end. So what are these four foundations of character that we get to from starting with the Reverend Dr. King and going to Larry Nucci and Marvin Berkowitz? First, character virtue development involves mutually beneficial relations between the individual and his context. And this may seem like an obvious statement to some of you in the room, but in the history of the study of human development, this is a fairly radical notion because human development has suffered by being framed by reductionistic and mechanistic ideas that have reduced human behavior to genes, to genetically proposed traits that supposedly are housed in the genes somehow and are invariant across time or place. And now we're moving to a different approach, which says the fundamental process of human development is a not only mutually influential, but in regard to character development, a mutually beneficial relation between person and context. And we saw that at the beginning, that it's not, character virtues are not just something that's good for the person, but it's good for the world in which that person exists. For those of you who follow human development or developmental science, this is one of my more nerdy overheads, and I apologize for it. All of the new ideas that support relational development come from a theory of theories, a philosophical model or a meta theory called relational developmental systems. Simply what that means is that human development involves relations between people and their world. Those relations change within the individual as he or she develops across time and place. And those relations are not random, they're systematic. And so all levels of organization, from the biological through the physical, ecological, and historical, are intimately related through these mutual relations. And when the individual acts on his or her world in a way that benefits that world, and the world at the same time supports that individual's thriving or flourishing, we call those adaptive developmental relations or adaptive developmental regulations. And I submit that character virtue development is the exemplar of these beneficial person context relations. The embeddedness in history, though, is very important because history imbues change across all levels of that person context relation. And when things change, they can change in one or two ways. They can change for the worse or they can change for the better. And change can be random or it could be systematic. When we see systematic change, we call that plasticity. And the presence of plasticity is a fundamental strength of human development. If there's plasticity, we don't have to relegate children to fixed mindsets, to the belief that they are born with these fixed genetically inherent traits and nothing can change. Plasticity promotes optimism, that if we're clever enough, we can align the strengths of individuals and the resources in their world to promote more positive development among every child. And I want to underline italics, bold, capital letters, every child. So what does adaptive developmental regulations, what do these mutually beneficial relations mean? First, and this is critical, and this is why coherence and not consistency is important, the world is constantly changing. People move, they develop, and so to have these beneficial relations, they must vary, they must change within the person across time and place. Therefore, character to be a strength, to reflect virtue, cannot be something that's fixed or immutable. Character involves doing the right thing in the right amount at the right time in the right place, and I'll emphasize in a moment, this is the Aristotelian concept of phronesis. So people with good character are adaptively coherent and not rigidly consistent. And so we can't talk about what's the average character, what's the average person do. Those averages make no sense because people are individuals in specific places at specific times, emitting the specific acts that are beneficial to them in their world. I'll come back to all of those points. We're now ready to move then to the second foundation of character virtue development, and that's coherence. And here we use the Aristotelian concept of phronesis to understand the specific ways in which an individual may contribute positively to the world that is supporting him or her. Phronesis was referred to in the Nicomachean Ethics as practical wisdom. It guides us to use the right virtue, whatever that may be, in the right amount, at the right time, in the right situation. And being from New England for the past 21 years, I'm always reminded by about the transcendental writers from New England, and Ralph Waldo Emerson in the middle of the 19th century, in a essay he wrote called Self-Reliance, said, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds." And invariance, doing the same thing across time and place, is antithetical to plasticity and to the essence of adaptive developmental regulations. So therefore, the hallmark of character virtues or character strengths is coherence, being in the habit. This is the Aristotelian notion of habit, of doing the right things at specific times, at specific places. Now, of course, I want to admit right away, none of us is perfect. We're all human. And so this is something we strive to, but only reach asymptotically, at infinity. We'll never be perfect, but a virtuous person is motivated to come up with the right virtue in the right time in the right place. So we can move then to the third component of character virtues. And that is, we need to focus in the study and in the promotion of character virtue on what happens at specific places, at specific times, through specific relationships. So let me take a step back and say a little bit about why this is so important in the field in which I work, developmental science. The goal of developmental science is to describe, explain, and optimize within-person change and between people differences in such within-person changes. Therefore, and this is critical, to study development, if we really want to understand the development of character virtues or character strengths, we must focus research, that means design, measurement, and data analysis on the person and what goes on within the person across time. To study development or character education programs, the focus must be on the individual, therefore, and on the changes in the variables we're studying within the person. When we do research and evaluation that focuses on how variables are related, that may be interesting, but such research or evaluation has absolutely nothing to do with development. Let me be very clear about that. If we only study variables, if we study, for example, grit at time 1 and how it produces or how it's correlated with academic achievement or well-being at time 2, to get that relationship where we're collapsing across, let's say, 100 people, that relationship may be highly significant, but it's a group, it's a population measure, and it doesn't say anything about how any individual among those 100 kids went from having grit at time 1 to having that translated in his or her life into academic achievement. Research and evaluation must be individually focused, not variable focused. This is formidable, but it's absolutely necessary. We now know, contrary to what I learned in high school biology, that no two people on the face of the earth have the same DNA, including monozygotic twins. Yes, monozygotic twins share nuclear DNA, but when we recognize that there is DNA in their mitochondria as well, and that they do not share that DNA, no two people start life with the same DNA. And that's the fundamental nature of biological existence. Moreover, this is not the time and the place to talk about the burgeoning research in epigenetics, but by the time they're 21, monozygotic twins share only 75% of the same functional genotype because they're existing at different times in different places, and that has different epigenetic marks. Their whole methylation system is going to be different. So as a consequence of the distinctiveness of the developmental pathway of every person on Earth, general approaches to character virtue development, such as using notions of average or prototypic concepts, or using the notion of trait, which is, again, a belief that there's some biological fixity that's immune to environmental influence, is wrong-headed approaches. So the necessary focus of research and evaluation must be on these mutually influential relations. So we need to challenge ourselves to address a complex, multi-part question based on the specificity of the relationships between individuals and their world. And the current president of the major scientific organization in the study of human development is the Society for the Study of Research in Child Development, SRCD. Mark Bornstein last year articulated what he said is the specificity principle that should be the focus of developmental science. So what we want to know is what specific actions of what specific individuals in what specific places, for how long, in what specific communities, societies, and cultures, and at specific times in the life of a child and in the history of his or her nation and culture, will result in what specific features of character development and what specific contributions to the self, to the family, to the community, and ultimately to civil society. Going back to that specific relationship, that phronesis of the relationship between individual character virtues and a civil society. Now, it's important to understand that even though we're starting at the individual level, and I'll say this more in the last foundational part, even though we are required, if we want to study development, to start at the level of the individual, that doesn't mean there are not group or even general principles. So one of the things that we've identified in our research, and I'm going to give you an example from 3 studies, one of which or 2 of which are ongoing, is that if you start at the individual level, you could still identify things that are happening in the world that shape the specific virtues needed at specific times and specific places. And we've discovered them across these 3 studies. And I call them the big 3 because they're in all programs that are successful in promoting character development. So within safe spaces, and that's critical, you need a context. You know, right now you're not going to get great character development programs in Syria. It's just too dangerous a place for all people to expect good character development programs to occur. But within safe spaces, there are 3 components of effective character development programs, character virtue development programs. First, positive and sustained relations between a caring, competent, and consistently available adult, a teacher, a coach, a mentor, a faith leader, who in the context of that enduring positive relationship builds life skills in the young person, like selecting positive goals, learning how to recruit the resources necessary to obtain those goals, and compensating when goals are blocked. By the way, this is Jen Urban's dissertation I'm talking about here. She identified these in her dissertation research. And opportunities for youth participation in and leadership of valued activities. So you give the young person who has now these life skills in the context of mentorship the opportunity to enact those specific attributes that are of value in that specific context at that specific time and that specific place. Let me give very quickly 3 examples from my own research. Many of you know the Boy Scouts program. We studied Boy Scouts of America, and particularly Cub Scouts, to a very generous grant from the John Templeton Foundation. And what we wanted to understand was, does Boy Scouts of America have an effect on character development? Do the programs of Boy Scouts of America, which are explicitly focused on a specific set of character virtues, are they effective? Everything I say in this study and in the other 2 studies I'm going to briefly mention are done with very rigorously constructed comparison groups. We use an econometric method called propensity score matching to identify youth who are as close as possible to the young people in the programs we're going to be talking about, but are different in that they are not in that program. Otherwise, they're very rigorously matched. So this is propensity score matched, at least in these first 2 studies. As you'll see, the 3rd study, there is no matching, and I'll explain why. So we studied scouts across 2.5 years, 5 times of testing. And what we saw is that those specific attributes of relevance to the character virtue goals of scouting, cheerfulness, obedience, helpfulness, kindness, trustworthiness, hopeful future expectations, were all increased in the scouts, but not in the comparison kids. Only one attribute did not change in the scouts, and this was religious reverence. They started and ended at exactly the same point. Well, isn't that an important virtue? Yes. But when we look at the comparison group, we hear a story. 60% of all scouts in the United States are in troops or packs in religious institutions. So most of the kids in our scout groups were from Catholic churches. So we took other kids who were not in scouts but were in Catholic schools and matched them. Their religious reverence decreased steadily across time. As they stayed longer and longer in Catholic school, their religious reverence went down. However, the scouts, their religious reverence stayed the same. So scouts had an important impact in maintaining religious reverence. We might come back to that in the Q&A. Let me turn to the second study. Compassion International is a international sponsorship organization. They're in 26 countries, serving about 1.8 million kids, the poorest kids in these nations. They have programs that go from infancy through young adulthood, but they came to Jackie Lerner and myself to work on positive youth development with a special focus on character development. And so I called this study, and it's funded by both Compassion and King Philanthropies. I call this study the Compassion International Study of Positive Youth Development. They call it Developing Responsible and Fulfilled Youth, a multinational. You can see the long name that they give it. I think calling it the CI study of PYD is easier to get out. Our goal is to get into 3 countries. Right now, we're in 2 countries, and we're addressing important issues as articulated by World Bank and USAID. We're collaborating with CI, Boston College, Fuller Theological Seminary. And USAID in particular has said there's really no theoretical underpinning of the bases of positive youth development in general or character virtue development in international programs. There's a lack of consistent and robust measurement and few instances of international longitudinal evaluations. So USAID has called for new strategies, new approaches to evaluation, and we're trying to answer this call. And research we're doing in 2 countries is asking basically the same question as with the Scouts. Are the CI programs really developing the specific virtues that they're interested in? This is all the youth are involved in churches in their country. So these are church-based programs. And so as a consequence, issues of spirituality and faith, hope for the future are important values, character virtues. So spirituality, hope, and thriving is central. We're working right now in 2 countries, El Salvador and Rwanda. We have done this work, and this is important if you remember that list that Bob McGrath had of character virtues. We are not presuming that the measures of positive development or character virtues that we started with in the US have relevance in either El Salvador or Rwanda. We're starting qualitatively and seeing what are the virtues that the young people, their pastors, their parents believe are important for this mutual benefit between self and society that character virtues are emblematic of. And so we start qualitatively, and then we try to triangulate with quantitative work. And what we found so far, again, with very rigorously matched, is that, in fact, one key component, at least in El Salvador, we're going next week, I think, Jonathan, to start our collection in Rwanda. Fidelity and character are much stronger in the CI youth than the non-CI youth. So that is a hint that the CI work is effective and developing the specific character attributes in that setting. Remember, both Boy Scouts, CI, and this next example all have this big 3. So here's my third example, and it's with the United States Military Academy at West Point, which has as its mission to develop leaders of character. we don't have a comparison group here. There is no second United States Military Academy at West Point. And for political reasons at this point, we're not looking at the Naval Academy or the Air Force Academy. We hope to and make comparisons. But right now, this is just West Point, and it's funded by the Templeton Religion Trust. Here is the mission of West Point, to develop leaders of character. And we call this Project Arete, which comes from the Greek excellence. So possessing qualities that make something the best of its kind. That's what West Point seeks to do. They want leaders of character. And although the same papers I do, and you know that of late they have some generals who failed to meet that high bar, they still pursue that. Again, we're starting to triangulate qualitative and quantitative work. And here are the measures that they've been using. They really haven't had a coherent view of what character is. They know they want leaders of character who serve with duty, honor, and courage. And so they've measured these characteristics and these characteristics. But are those the best way to summarize what they're doing? We found through both exploratory and confirmatory factor analytic methods that there are really 4 types of character that are specific to West Point. Relational character, which involves leadership, intellectual openness, relational humility, social intelligence, empathy, and teamwork. Commitment, hardiness, optimism, purpose, grit, honor. And then there is a negative one that is, thank goodness, inversely related, which is a Machiavellian dimension of control, distrust, manipulation, and intellectual arrogance. I could actually think of some Americans who display that, but they, thank goodness, didn't go to West Point. So now we turn to our last pillar, and that is, I've argued that we need to start at the level of the individual, and that's this is the nerdiest part of my presentation. So please bear with me. I'll try to get through it relatively quickly. This is idiographic analysis, and that is that we want to start at the individual and build up from the individual. The reason we want to do this is because of the specificity of human development. It doesn't take huge studies of hundreds of people to start at the individual. And if we start with qualitative research, we could really be effective in learning the dimensions of character virtues that are relevant at specific times, specific places, in specific settings. We need to get away from these topologies which say, you know, there are big 5 personality traits, or even the VIA, the Peterson and Seligman typologies. All of those are variable-centered conceptions. They look at how variables go together across people and have no information whatsoever about how development happens for those variables within a person across time and place. Let me take you back to a 1948 statement by Clyde Kluckhohn and Henry Murray. And that really captures what I'm trying to say. We've already seen this in the juxtaposition of the Bornstein specificity hypothesis and the generality of the big 3. Kluckhohn and Murray said, all people are like all other people, all people are like only some other people, and each person is like no other person. Each of us has characteristics that we share with all people. We all have respiratory systems and digestive systems. All people are like only some other people. Men have a different reproductive system than a woman, but each person, starting from their DNA, is unique. And we have to honor all 3 of those and not ignore any one of them. But traditionally, we've started at the general level and used statistics that started at the what's called the nomothetic or general, and we've ignored, or even worse, treated as error, individual variation. 2 incredibly brilliant mathematical statisticians who are also developmental scientists, Peter Molinar from Amsterdam and John Nesselrode from University of Virginia, have change the way we think about statistics. And for the other social scientists in the room, I want to tell you that I'm challenging the very foundations of every stat course you ever took. I'm telling you that if you want to study development, we don't start with averages and standard deviations. Those statistics are based on mathematical ideas called the ergodic theorems. And to calculate an average across 30 people, or across people at time 1 and time 2, you have to make 2 assumptions. First, that all people in a group are the same. Otherwise, you're mixing apples and oranges. You can't add up all the scores and divide by the number of people in the group. So homogeneity is one assumption of the ergodic theorems, and the other is stationarity. That is, people don't change. They stay the same across time and place. Nesselrode and Molinar have shown that those assumptions don't hold for any study of human development. I'm not going to go over this. This talks about the various methods that they use. I have this here, and of course, all of you are welcome to have copies of my overheads, and I'll be happy to talk to you more about how you actually would do this statistical work. But the idea is you start with the individual, and then you go to the subgroup, and then you see if the entire group moves together. Let me use this visual. This is called the Cattell data box. Any observation in human development involves a combination of 3 things. A variable studied in a person, studied at a specific time. Actually this works for all science. The person could be any entity that you're measuring. So in human development, we study this data box is important. Every observation in human development involves a combination of person, variable, and time. Traditionally, the ergodic theorems have led us to look at how variables go together across people within time. What I'm saying is we need to start by looking at how variables go together within a person across time. Only that approach, and only that approach, is an approach that studies development. You cannot study development by looking at how variables go together across people. Doing that is equivalent to no information at all about human development. A great book, I recommend it. It's a book that reads almost like a novel. Todd Rose, my colleague at Harvard, has written a book called The End of Average. It's based on Nesselrode and Molinar's work. And he introduces 3 concepts. At any point in time, because of the specificity of time and place, we all have a different array of virtues that we will show at specific times and specific places. That's called jaggedness. Context matters. Because the context is always changing, we will never replicate the exact contextual conditions that we had a day ago, a week ago. And so no one walks into the same river twice. Pathways. All of us, because all of us have specific person-context relations, and this underscores why we have to start with the individual, we all walk the road less traveled. If we ignore the individual humanity of a person, of each individual, we'll never understand him or her or virtue development. So now let me make concluding remarks and give some time for Q&A. What I've talked about is phronesis, the importance of time and place, and specificity. And so we have a big question to answer when we're studying character virtue development. Through what individual context relations do specific character virtue attributes develop at specific times and specific places? That's the question that developmental scientists are aiming at, and that's what I tried to illustrate very briefly, admittedly, in the 3 studies I talked about. So here are some implications. Beginning one's research or program evaluation efforts by a focus on variables or on groups of people runs the risk of collecting data that are not applicable to any specific person. Think about that. If you just focus on the average, it may not be applicable to any person in the group you're studying. because such work won't illuminate within-person changes that define the course of character virtue development. Now, Claude Rose, Peter Molinar, John Nesselrode, myself, all focus on quantitative methods to get at individuality. Through my students and colleagues, I have late in life learned that old dogs can learn new tricks, and I'm moving into mixed method work, and that's why we're starting in internationally by looking at the qualitative meaning of virtues in each setting within which we work. And there are numerous qualitative methods. I'm most familiar with the ones that come from the social behavioral science literature, ethnographic and narrative analyses. But I don't want to gainsay the importance of using artistic approaches to understand individuals. So literature and film are two important ways of, and I would add the media, are important ways of understanding the individuality of what character means at a specific time, a specific place, in a specific culture. By the way, that guy with the mustache is not me writing there. That's actually Sir Arthur Conan Doyle writing a Sherlock Holmes story. One of my favorite authors. Okay. So let me end by addressing the really big question about virtue development and coming back to where I started, come back to Dr. King, because I think he is a person who's inspired us to think about the content of character as a way of organizing our goals and in at least my nation. How do we identify the specific attributes of specific people that go together with specific features of their context to promote individuals coherently doing the right thing, acting for the mutual benefit of themselves and their social worlds? If that is what we devote our science and our practice to, then it will give us knowledge that scientists, practitioners, and policymakers can together use to create individualized means to enhance the probability of individual thriving for every person, and through the virtuous actions of these individuals, realize the dream of Dr. King to create a world of enhanced democracy, liberty, equity, and social justice. So thank you for your attention.
Okay, so I'm going to open up the floor now to questions for you. Okay?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I have a few, but I'll just start with one. I want to talk a little bit about external validity and the value of learning. And I understand that your big three differ from the big five, and that the big five are like character traits and they're sort of static definitions, where your big three are more like experiences. But
I'm talking about something very different. The big five personality traits are presumably, purportedly inborn attributes of people.
That's right. That's
like
right.
Disagreeableness, neuroticism, extroversion, and
right. The canoe skills. Sure. Yeah. So I mean, I'm referring to the big five just because they're very popular right now, and they're sort of kind of getting to the center of the conversation on the monitoring and evaluation side of things. But there still remains this need for external validity. If we're going to apply learning into a new context, what can we learn by applying your big three, right? These experiences, these things which will generate context-specific character. How do we then take that learning and take it then to a new context? Do we still?
Good question. That's a wonderful question. The big three that I enumerated are really a reduction from 8 attributes that were in the Eccles and Gutmann National Academy of Sciences report of 2002, which listed 8 attributes of effective positive youth development programs. In a 2012 meeting, Reed Larson, who actually listed the 8 in the original document, reduced them to these 3, along with other independent people, myself, Jeannie Brooks-Gunn, Robert Blum. So these are 3 attributes of a setting within which people co-act to develop. Now, what you're pointing to is exactly the overhead that I said I'm not going to go into because it's too abstract. So I want to make 2 points. First, your question is exactly the right question to ask, because how do you go from the individual or idiographic to anything general? Science works on generalities, not on each individual one at a time. Nesselrode and Molinar have found that those relationships at the individual level, when factored across individuals through a technique called the idiographic filter, can produce, if it's empirically justifiable, common second order factors that are generalized across person and setting. But it is a statistical process that takes first order observations, or if you will, manifest observations, and moves them to the latent level. What is maintained is the individual dynamic model of each person, which can remain distinct, and yet you have commonality at the latent level, if it's empirically justifiable. So you can get external validity if it exists, but now you're testing it rather than assuming it by imposing a population statistic and saying we'll just average. So you're actually doing science much more rigorously by testing your assumptions and then seeing how far you can generalize. However, I would add one thing, and I'm hoping, I don't know, Jen, I know has limited time. Jen Urban has, one of the papers that Jen shared with the group, the Urban, Hargraves, and Trochim paper. Jen, what, didn't you share that?
I did.
Yeah. So if you read that paper, Jen pays particular attention to not just external validity, but a third sort of validity. We use a different term for Jen and I, but I think we now agree. And that's ecological validity.
I added it in, Rich.
What?
I've since added it in.
Oh, okay, great. So we're going to need to go beyond internal validity and external validity. And so Jen, will you be talking about that this afternoon?
I will, yes.
Oh, great. So she's much smarter and much more eloquent than I am. So she will show how we can move beyond even external to really understand what is real and important in a program at a specific time and a specific place. Her approach is really an idiographic approach. Jen, I shouldn't be putting words in your mouth, but I think I know your approach. It helps a community, it helps an organization to come up with a meaningful idiographic approach to their program that has resonance at the ecologically valid level.
Just to test my understanding, those second order traits then that are generated, do those look
I wouldn't call them traits, the second order attributes.
attributes? Okay, thank you. This is what I meant about parsing the language. This is good for me. Yeah. So those second order attributes, do we use the same sort of language and definitions in the types of things that other researchers are sort of measuring as first order, or are they something distinct from what we are used to seeing?
Another great question. They're distinct because they're starting not with the assumptions of ergodicity. They're starting with the assumptions of non-ergodicity. I'm sorry for those of you, this is very nerdy and very statistical, and I apologize. But to answer the question, it starts with the assumption that the individual level is an important level. Go back to that Kluckhohn and Murray quote. And it says to start at the population level and in effect treat individual variation around that population level as error variance is conceptually inadequate because there can be systematic individual variation. And if that's the case, we need to identify the systematic individual variation at the manifest level or at the first order level. If you let's say we're at different factor levels at the first order level, and then test if there can be integration at a second order level. And is that integration for subgroups like males and females? There's evidence that is not always the same. Poor versus non-poor. El Salvadorian versus Rwandan. Is there commonality or difference? And then let's say we find some. Can we go to a higher level and bring in, let's say, a third nation, a fourth nation? But this is standard ways of testing what's called measurement invariance. Most of us were trained to worry about reliability and validity. But now, current emphases in measurement talk about measurement invariance. And measurement invariance itself is complex. There are 4 levels of measurement invariance. And I don't know if we want to get into that, but it's called configural, metric, intercept, and then strict invariance, which involves a commonality of residual variance. But we have been using methods. I was on a USAID panel, and people took measures, from the United States and just shifted them to other countries without establishing that those measures were equivalent. We can't do that anymore. And this is why USAID said we need to start and understand what is specific about positive development, character strengths in each country. And yes, that is a challenge and it's rigorous, but you have a foundation here that's interested in changing the way we study character virtue development internationally. And they're putting money behind that. So we have an opportunity to do things in ways that will really celebrate the diversity of individuals and cultures around the world.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Matthew.
I just wanted to quickly comment, Dr. Lerner, that I think this resonates a lot, particularly in applicability. I mentioned briefly, I spent a number of years working for an organization that provided services to folks with developmental disability, autism, Down syndrome, in the late 80s, early 90s, and beyond. And this was in New York, coming out of deinstitutionalization. So most of them had come from institutions, very isolated existences with their parents, and we were now creating community programs. And we had got a reputation for being successful because we kind of reversed that paradigm. Instead of looking at, here are the characteristics of the population or what we know or what studies tell you about folks with autism, folks with Down syndrome, we then started, more importantly, working on the configuration of the individual. And so rather than putting people in programs based on an external stigma, we would have looked at who these individuals are and how we collectively work together. And so we were able to build on strengths, identify key, unique components, and out of that foster programs and opportunities for growth that worked very much in this space. I think the challenge, the opportunity at that point was we were getting a brand new population. We were getting people that weren't really understood in so many ways, hadn't been fully studied. I think the challenge in this way becomes you're fighting against so many established paradigms and structures that moving into this model of looking at the individual in some ways rails against a lot of the systems, programs, funding opportunities out there. I think that's going to be a shift that we have to look at. I also think it's really critical to highlight that last point is the essential component of applying something in the appropriate context. We do a lot of drawing for research and bringing it, but with always the nod that we have a focus of local folks looking at how do you make that information relevant in a Bahamian context? What works in Singapore isn't going to translate here. So I think
and I think Danny will help you figure that out this afternoon.
Great.
She's nodding, so I'm guessing who's going to do that.
And actually, my question draws upon what Aaron and Matt just talked about, and that is, now that we're going from the individual to develop some second order latent attributes, what does that say about new ways of theory building and then intervention design? Because it seems like we're now going in the opposite direction. How can we be assured that because we want to look at character development from an individual's perspective, from an individual's context and their actions at a certain place in a certain time, it seems, not that it seems, this is the complete reverse way of...
It is exactly, you're exactly correct. It is exactly reverse. That's why I said I'm changing the direction of the statistical training we all had.
And my question is then, how then do we go about designing studies if we're actually looking at it from the other way, without just sort of shooting in the dark and seeing if it works in this specific context, this specific time, in this specific place?
So first, let me say that the reverse approach, the top, if you will, the top down, the focus on the average approach, has roundly failed empirically. The effect sizes we're getting are minuscule. Let me go back to the big five. The big five personality traits are supposed to be innate, immutable across time and place. And people have evolved the big five traits. There's now something called cybernetic big five theory. It boils down to the same thing, old wine in a new bottle. If you look across time and place, what is the highest stability coefficient reported in the literature between the measure of any of the big five characteristics across age? Do you know what the literature says? The stability coefficient's a 0.3. Now, what that means for those who are not statistically into this work, that means that 0.3 means that 91% of the variance, 91% of the differences between people across time are unaccounted for by the big three, by the big five. The big five vary across time and place. So how, if you have brown eyes at age 21, you're gonna have brown eyes at age 24. You're gonna have brown eyes at age 27. But if you have conscientiousness for a group at age 21, 24, 25, 91% of the time it's going to be different. That's what that means, in effect. So the top-down approach has failed miserably. The individual approach, the non-ergodic approach, the idiographic approach that I'm suggesting is radical and complex. It will take a huge investment to show that this approach matters. It is still a promissory note. However, I can share with you today that the Chan-Zuckerberg initiative, which some of you have heard about, this is an initiative started by Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook and his wife, Priscilla Chan, who's a pediatrician. They have invested over $1 billion in developing personalized learning science. It's called the Science of Learning and Development. There are 2 articles about it that are now online in a wonderful journal called Applied Developmental Science. Jen can tell you all about it. One is by Pam Cantor and colleagues. The other is by David Oster and colleagues. And what they explain is that we now have the science to study individuals and move through the sorts of methods that Nesselrode and Molinari are talking about the group. What Chan and Zuckerberg have invested in is to develop measures of individual attributes, and I've convinced them through begging and pleading that some of the attributes should be character-virtue attributes. They are measuring things like growth mindset, executive functioning, intentional self-regulation, things that do converge with those variables of interest to Sir John. But they're also going to be measuring character virtues, developing measures. I'm working on a project with several colleagues from across the country to develop measures from age 5 to age 22 and integrating them by starting at the individual level. We're doing small individual studies of 10 to 20 people each, and then using another technique called integrated data analysis, putting those together. We're launching 3 longitudinal studies. One, elementary school kids, middle school kids, and then high school kids moving into college. We're studying them intensely for over 100 days each with these individualized measures, and then integrating those longitudinal studies statistically and looking to see if we can understand the pathways at the individual level and the commonalities that exist. Yes, it's taking many, many millions of dollars, and even rich foundations like the 3 Templeton foundations probably do not have the resources that the Facebook people have. However, I can also report that Facebook is reaching out to folks, at least at the John Templeton Foundation, to create a partnership so that will assure that character virtues will be part of this new study. But we can't be sure yet that this will work. No one has attempted to integrate the lifespan in this way, but I'm here to talk about where theory is, where research is, and what is now possible to do given 3 things: the will, the money, and the science.
Well, we would just like to say thank you very much